We now live in an era of extraordinary possibilities. Technology connects continents in seconds. Trade fuels shared prosperity, and global challenges like climate change demand collective action across borders. Yet even as nations grow more interconnected, divisions deepen, misunderstandings and mistrust threaten to pull us apart. In today's world, no nation can go it alone. The stakes couldn't be higher for leaders, for citizens, and for generations yet to come. So today we ask, how can the world's two largest economies, the United States and China, balance competition with collaboration? Can trade and investment survive the rising storm of suspicion? What happens to the rest of the world if they can't? And when rhetoric turns toxic, who loses the most? The powerful or the people?
Welcome to Deep Dive, brought to you by CGTN and Mengguan in Beijing. It is our honor today to have a cutting-edge group of panelists with us today. Here, let me introduce each and every one of them. Dr. Wang Huyao Henry is founder and president of Center for China and Globalization. Henry, always good to see you. We also have Dr. Fabian Zulig. He's the chief executive and chief economist of the European Policy Center in Brussels. That is a leading independent think tank focusing on European affairs. We also have Mr. Doug Bendo, Senior Fellow at Cato Institute, based in Washington, D.C. He's also the former Special Assistant to President Ronald Reagan. And last but certainly not least, we have Mr. Dennis Simon, non-resident fellow at Quincy Institute and senior lecturer at Asian Pacific Studies Institute at Duke University. Henry, let me go to you first, if you don't mind. Sure. A suspension of additional tariffs, also lowering existing tariff rates, what looks like a lowering of temperatures, hostility as well between China and the United States. How do you think all these negotiations in Geneva will set the scene for the next phase of negotiations? What is the end game here, the grand bargain? What would that look like?
Thank you, Wang Guan. Absolutely. I mean, we see the truce now reached between U.S. and China on this trade war. And, about April 2nd to May 9 or 10, it's about 40 days of tremendous anxiety and the tariff disruptions and all those fear throughout the world. And in the market, we see all those tumbling and confidence defeated, and of course the world probably getting into a major recession. But I think fortunately rationale prevailed, particularly the business community, because you know that President Trump announced a $100 billion exemption. So I think that business intertwined, that nobody has actually realized how deeply intertwined we are already in the 21st century. So it doesn't really make work, and then it's going to affect I heard Trump's base. So I think quickly, they all realize it's not good for both countries, and it's not good for the world. So I think the end game now is that there's another 20% raised on the fentanyl. I think that could be quickly dropped because since the Biden administration, China-U.S. already done a lot of work on the fentanyl. So in the end, probably will be 10% remain, which is a U.S. universal tariff on the UK, on EU. Probably we could probably live with that. And but again, China is going to pursue more openness. Like China actually lifted the tariff to 0 for 43 least developing countries. So I think as long as we have much larger work to be done, like peace deal, rather than trade deal. So I would think that U.S. and China could probably reach some new understanding. We're going to have an APEC summit this year. We're going to have a UN's 80 years anniversary summit and the G20. I'm hoping that both leaders from China and U.S. could have a head of diplomacy between the two countries, and we could probably put that at a manageable level and really for the sake of the world.
Henry, you talk about a peace deal, ideally in a perfect world, but what we have is what looks like a containment strategy pursued by Trump and then Biden and then Trump again. And then behind that, the U.S. national security establishment insisting on containing a near peer, and in this case, China. So how optimistic or concerned, rather, are you when it comes to the U.S. long-term strategy of containing a near peer, in this case, China?
Well, I think probably there's a two school of school now in the U.S. administration. But I see President Trump, since his election campaign, he has said 30, 40 times good thing about China. He's a friend of President Xi, and he says that if China-U.S. works together, nothing in the world they cannot resolve. And furthermore, I think that he's not interested in autocracy versus democracy, the old narrative of Biden administration. So in that sense, if he wants to make a deal, China probably is a perfect partner to make deals. So I can also see his second term, he's much more in control of his hawks, and then they follow Trump's leadership. I would think there's still opportunity, but of course in the long run, of course there's structural competition there. But let's make it more manageable. Let's make it more Olympic-style competition rather than containment and rivalry of deadly relations.
Yeah, fair play is what we need. Fabian, let me turn to you. In 2021, you coined a very interesting term that is permacrisis. That is a state of permanent overlapping crises covering economic, security, trade, and even academic issues, social issues, making volatility the new norm. Can you explain to our viewers what this permacrisis entail in this day and age, and also bring us the European perspective on all this?
The term really came out of the observation that in Europe, ever since really the beginning of the 2000s, Europe has had a number of interrelated crises which have challenged the European system, which have made it very difficult to deal with the deep-seated issues which we have to deal with. Now, we coined that term in 2021, very much looking at Europe, but I would argue that we really are at a point now where it is a global permacrisis, where we need to understand that the new normal is much higher levels of uncertainty, much higher levels of volatility. Yes, part of that is being created by the new Trump administration, but there are also much more structural reasons behind this. And what it means is that we are struggling to deal with the common challenges which we have at the global level. The common challenges such as climate change, but also in the containment of the conflicts which are there. We really have a situation in Europe where it is no longer about economic prosperity first and foremost. It is about basic security. It is about surviving in this much more challenging and much more difficult world.
How do you feel as a European scholar when the current U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference, basically lecturing the Europeans on what norms should be, on what human rights should constitute, so on and so forth?
It was a shock for many Europeans. Certainly, having that. Not only the content of the speech, but also the tone of the speech, the way it was brought across. It showed very clearly that for this administration, the alliance with Europe, which has been there ever since the Second World War, does not have an important consideration in the mind of the president, in the mind of the vice president. But it also showed to Europeans that we have to take more responsibility for our own affairs. First and foremost, security. That is the defining feature of the current moment. But also in terms of how we interact with the rest of the world when it comes to trade, when it comes to the economy. So in a way, what that speech did is it made Europe grow up. We are starting now to become more assertive, more confident, and Europe is actually acting together in a much more decisive way than it has for a very long time.
Yeah, we'll talk about Europe's new posture later on. I think not only Europe stood up and grew up in a way China has too in terms of innovation, thanks to Trump's technological blockade and trade restrictions. I mean, Susan Thornton, the former State Department official in charge of Asia, earlier talked about the fact that the Trump administration's policies vis-a-vis China actually helped China become a better innovator. In that regard. Doug, let me turn to you. You said you're not a big fan of tariff brinksmanship. You're not a big fan of total decoupling. And Cato Institute is a renowned organization doing quantitative research to back up those claims. Talk to us about that.
Well, the problem we see today, I think, with the Trump tariff war with China is it's really two levels. One is that Trump is committed to a much more mercantile kind of economic system, and that applies to everyone. And second is then China uniquely. And it's something with his, I think, he looks at it primarily in an economic standpoint, but he certainly has to respond to military lobbies, national security lobbies, human rights and other issues that are out there. So kind of looking at China, both of those are in play. And we saw that with his first administration. I think he likes the idea of making a deal with China. He wants to have a relationship, but he's also quite willing to go political if he thinks that it's useful for his own political prospects, or if he thinks he has to deal with, some of the influential factions within American politics. I mean, we at the Cato Institute believe that, broadly speaking, market-oriented, freedoms are very important for economic development. We also think they're good for human rights. And we believe that applies to countries across the board, that it makes sense to have a freer trade regime. There are always going to be exceptions. Some of those are going to be political. Some of those might be national security. But you want them to be the exceptions and not the rule. And what we see him doing is very destructive. That is essentially almost destroying an international trading order that has built up in recent decades with many free trade agreements, expanding the opportunities and options for people that are most important for people at the bottom of the economic pile, but are important for everyone. And I think China is a great example of the power of markets and trade, of its change, coming out of isolation, adopting market reforms, and today China being one of the premier countries in terms of economic strength, indeed purchasing power parity.
Do you think the U.S.-led liberal world order since 1945 is officially ended, or rather upended, by the current U.S. president himself?
Well, he has certainly upended it, I think. And it was, frankly, time for it to be upended. That is, it was an order that had a lot of value, but it was also an order created by a set of states in a very different time. And it's certainly fair to have a country like China come along and say, you were making this order when we were not participating. Now we want to say in how that order looks.
China was a member of the UN back in 1945, but a much weaker
but it was
force.
Much weaker. It didn't have the kind of global clout, and it did not have the involvement in international commerce that it has today. So it really was not taken into account when that order was being created. And the same thing with the Global South. So I think today the order has to adjust for a Global South that has many important members out there. One thinks of India, one can think of South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Indonesia, Brazil. There are many nations that are growing that are very important.
That really leads to my next question. Dennis, let me ask you, you are the founder and the champion of U.S.-China engagement in terms of innovation. You founded this organization called U.S.-China Innovation Dialogue. I would say a very important organization. And you also said that Global South is a force to be reckoned with. Talking about innovation in China, you published an article about it, saying that innovation in China is challenging the global science and technology system. Talk to us about that.
So we're now experiencing, I think, a structural change in what we would call the global innovation system. So China's rise is not an aberration. If you would have tracked the statements from Chinese leaders since 1979 when they opened up and engaged in economic reform, there was a sustained commitment to close the gap between China and the rest of the world. It was a 20 or 25-year gap when this all began, and gradually but steadily through policy reforms, through changes, through adjustments, and in fact, China has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of globalization. Its participation in international science and technology affairs, in regional science and technology affairs, the sending of young people overseas for advanced education, all of these things have helped contribute to a sustained shift from the factory to the world kind of model now to an innovation-driven economy. And we see probably the most recent case of DeepSeek, where China has kind of broken through in the world of AI language models, that China now can have different models of innovation, not simply copycat innovation, but also in some cases disruptive innovation. Recently I talked to two people from East Africa who said that they thought that their countries were shut out of the AI revolution because the humongous costs in terms of GPUs and investment dollars. But with the DeepSeek success and the open architecture, they see now that global South countries now can participate, maybe even fully engage in this AI revolution. So China may have started something much bigger than the bilateral connectivity here. It may have global ramifications much more than we can appreciate right now.
That's really awesome. Also, do you mind telling us a bit about the U.S.-China innovation dialogue and how that is contributing to the more nuanced understanding between the two sides?
Unfortunately, that dialogue ended around 2017, 2018, near the tail end of the Trump administration.
Yeah, I noticed.
It began in 2007, 2008. It met every few years, and it was a two-level dialogue. There was a government-to-government discussion about innovation-related issues, and there were two experts groups of academics and think tank people on the Chinese side and a similar group on the U.S. side. And we had very, very fruitful discussions that then fed into the policy discussions among the government officials. But unfortunately, people felt that China was benefiting too much and the United States was not benefiting enough from that dialogue, and they brought it to a halt. It's ironic you asked me about that, because yesterday I was with some people from the science and technology institutions in China, and we talked about renewing the dialogue. We talked about bringing back together the experts groups, non-governmental discussion and communication about innovation trends, where they're headed, and what the implications might be for renewing more engagement in science and technology between the two countries. So we're at an important point, and I would just add that one of the important consequences of the agreement reached in Geneva, it might create some goodwill and spillover. So in areas like science and technology, where things have come more or less to an abrupt halt, we might be able to leverage that goodwill and use that to re-engage, particularly because in December 2024, at the tail end of the Biden administration, the bilateral cooperation agreement in science and technology between the two countries was renewed. It had been signed almost automatically every 5 years, but under Biden it was delayed. The negotiations were rather extended, and some people were not very optimistic it would ever be signed. But thank goodness it was signed in December. The problem is that now it's dormant and languishing, and the Trump administration could build on the goodwill from the trade discussions and say, hey, let's dabble a little bit now in renewing S&T ties, and something good could come out of it.
Very good. Fabian, you made a very bold suggestion, or a suggestion that's also echoed by many serious European scholars, saying that the European policymakers and parliamentarians should perhaps think more liberally about moving away from the treaty commitments in order for more agility and flexibility to better defend European interests. And in your own words, you called for an avant-garde of willing member states to pilot defense and external action projects beyond current treaty constraints. Explain to us what that means.
Well, in Europe, we have built the European integration process over the decades, and it has worked remarkably well. So it is a success story, but we also have to reflect on the kind of challenges we are facing today and how we can deal with those within the context of European integration. And there we have found that now we're moving into areas such as defense and security. It becomes difficult to have all the countries on board. Some countries have different views on where Europe should go. The vast majority wants to move in the same direction, but is also constrained if that happens within the treaty framework. So what we have proposed is that the term, which is now very popular, that coalitions of the willing can move ahead, can advance areas such as defense and security, but they should do that in a way which is very much aligned with how the European Union works, which is open to other countries within Europe to enter. But that also means that we can integrate non-EU countries. And in particular, when we look at defense and security, this has opened up the possibilities for reintegrating the United Kingdom into some of what Europe is developing at the moment. It has some risks. Very clearly, this is not the way we have done it over the last decades. But at this current moment, we have to really focus on the challenges. And this is one way we can make progress and make substantive progress so that we get to the point where we get into these new areas of Europe.
Do you expect China to come in as a stronger partner? Do you think the European policymakers can reimagine their relations with China?
I think there's certainly very much a discussion at this moment in time about how Europe interacts with the rest of the world. That includes, of course, a change in the relationship with the United States, which is already happening. But it does also include considerations on how we work together with all the countries, including China, of course. So there is a real opportunity, but there are also a number of frictions. There are a number of barriers in the system. So there needs to be a look from both sides of how can we address those, in what areas can we move forward, in what areas is it more difficult. But I think what is very important in all of this is that we find ways of having more dialogue so that we also understand each other's concerns. So we need to have that conversation to see that we can align our interests and can overcome the frictions which are there in the relationship.
Yeah. I want to move on from Europe to across the Atlantic to the United States. Doug, you mentioned power centers in Washington, D.C., beltway lobbyists, industrial lobbies, military lobbies, the close-knit circles of Trump, and also the bureaucrats running the institutions in Washington. What do you think is the end game of the United States when it comes to strategy vis-a-vis China? Do they want to be down near peer, to drag China down?
It really varies. There are some people very hostile to China, and that's had an impact within the political process. Over the last 8 or 10 years, both Republicans and Democrats have generally moved in a more hostile direction. At the same time, a lot of American companies have grown more disillusioned about their time in China, so you haven't had as consistent business support for the relationship as you once had. And this helps explain how essentially U.S. government moved from Trump, which was primarily trade issues, and then in his final year, the issue of COVID, which was very much a political issue in terms of his reelection, to where Biden adopted a fairly large-scale industrial policy that included restrictions on China and in terms of U.S. subsidies for, say, semiconductor production. And that was a move to view China as being, in certain ways, a dangerous competitor, that the U.S. wanted to make sure it did not fall behind China in certain areas. I think that the broad sweep of U.S. policy is not to try to destroy China, but rather an attempt to maintain U.S. dominance in what are viewed as the most important areas. One of that's military, including in Asia. So the military has become a competitive area. And another are kind of the commanding heights of technology. So we think about semiconductor chips, now we think about AI. There are some others that come into that. And to the good, the discussion in certain ways has grown more restrained. That is, people are less likely to talk about decoupling in some massive attempt to pull apart supply chains, and more saying, well, the U.S. doesn't want to be overly dependent on China for, say, rare earths or for pharmaceuticals or something. And I think Trump fits more with that Trump does like making deals. Trump clearly, at least in his own mind, gets along with President Xi Jinping. I think Trump would like to find a stable relationship, and one that is not focused on the military. To his credit, he doesn't like the idea of war. That you can criticize his policies, and he's not the best diplomat, obviously. Nevertheless, he is not somebody who wants conflict. I think Taiwan's an issue, where Trump has indicated reluctance to treat that as a security issue, while President Joe Biden on 4 occasions said America would intervene. Trump has never said that. So my hope is that Trump, given the credibility that he has in terms of trade and other issues, is in a position to be more restrained in the final result, and that he will try to come up with an agreement with the PRC that preserves an economic relationship. It'll be more restrictive than I would like. I think there are going to be tariffs in places I wouldn't like them. Nevertheless, I think he is committed to having a relationship that is a serious one and a beneficial one for the future, though he's going to be buffeted by a lot of the different interests on both Democrats and Republicans.
Dennis, Doug is basically saying that as long as the U.S. can maintain some sort of supremacy when it comes to defense, technology, artificial intelligence, it's okay to work with China on other issues that concerns all of us. Do you agree?
It concerns me. It concerns me because this idea that we can turn down, China's growth and that will be the recipe for moving up on our own field. I think that that's not a recipe for long-term success. We've invested in the development of the Chinese economy from 1980 all the way till about 2010 or so. And as we got towards the tail end of the Obama administration, things began to unravel. But at that time, this is when China was beginning to acquire momentum in its R&D system, in its improvement of its universities. In other words, across the board, its science and technology capabilities were growing, developing, and at the very moment where China really has something to provide to us, in other words, the basis for real mutual benefit, we now talk about delinking or lessening engagement with China. So it concerns me. Recently, the U.S. Congress put out a letter to the president of Duke University asking that Duke terminate its relationship with Wuhan University, and Duke Kunshan, where I had been the executive vice chancellor, was one of the most successful joint venture universities in China. It would be a horrible development if that were to actually occur. We have 6 universities now that are being investigated for being too chummy with China, as if there's a chummy index in which if you're too close to China, there must be something wrong. And as I said, we have not really put money, projects, and activity into that renewed science and technology agreement.
Gentlemen, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's discussion. Great insights, a fascinating conversation. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of Deep Dive on CGTN. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. I'll see you again next time.